I guess the question on the table that your book raises is, which hell in whose handbasket is our country going into? And so maybe just a quick, for those who are coming to it fresh, which hell in whose handbasket are we going into, actually?
I chose this title, which connotes hell in a handbasket, because I wanted to sound the alarm, and because I feel there is still time to course correct, and I feel that when you see the iceberg about to hit the Titanic, this is the time to shout the alarm and use a title that is startling, Third World America. The reason why I believe we are on this trajectory, and the reason why I believe there is a particular hell at the end of it, is because of what's happened to the middle class, first and foremost. I mean, there are many other reasons that are mentioned in the book, including our crumbling infrastructure, to mention an obvious one. But the fate of the middle class is particularly central to America, because it is so central to the American dream, to what America is about. And if we become a country of extremes, which is where it seems we're headed, with the rich on the one hand and everybody else struggling, then we're not America. You know, we are Venezuela, Brazil, Mexico, nothing wrong with these countries, but they're not America. And the essence of the American dream has always been upward mobility.
I imagine a number of people here are either business people or business students. So the question most business people are asking is, when do we get back to normal? And your book sort of says it kind of says we're not going to get back to normal, are we? That normal's going to be very different, even if we're not Venezuela.
Yeah, no, I think that we have two choices. One is to be a third world country, and the other is to be better than normal. We don't have anything in between. If we're
and that's
not
a change from where we were.
Yes, I think that there have to be a lot of changes from where we were. And what makes me optimistic, in fact, if you are too busy to read the whole book, I urge you to read just section 5, which is about solutions, because I feel that we don't have a lot of time. So if we can all focus on solutions, we'll be able to turn things around. If you want to take my diagnosis just on faith. But the reason why I'm optimistic is because I believe in the zeitgeist. I believe that there is such a thing as a zeitgeist. And I hope maybe somebody smart here is going to come up with a good English translation. But you all know what we mean. There is a spirit of the times.
Something in the air that is prevailing.
In the air. Yeah. And Jonas Salk summed up the zeitgeist before he died when he said that we're moving from what he called Epoch A, which was based on competition and survival, to Epoch B, which is based on collaboration and meaning. So if the zeitgeist is moving in that direction, and I profoundly believe that, and I provide a lot of evidence why I believe that in the book, then tapping into it means that we can get to a new normal, which is going to be very different than where we came from, which is going to be much more about collaboration, which is going to be in business terms much more about triple bottom lining rather than just bottom lining, which is going to be much more about making giving back part of our lives, which is going to be much less about expecting a shortcut to the American dream by turning your house into an ATM and expecting no proof of income, no down payment, financial success.
Got a lot of villains in the book, and most of them seem pretty deserved.
And a lot of heroes.
And a lot of heroes, but aren't most of us kind of in the middle, where we're working for a lot of the companies that were exploitive in one way or another?
We're all in the middle in a very profound way. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that the line between good and evil passes through every man's and woman's heart. He didn't say woman, so I'm adding that. But my point is that I agree with you. I mean, we're all a mixture. That's why I think this is such an interesting crossroads, because we don't know whether the baser instincts or our better angels are going to prevail. And we see at the moment in the country evidence of both. We see in the explosion of anger and demonizing and scapegoating which way we could go. And of course, many countries have gone that way during economic anxiety. And we see through the explosion of creativity and compassion and generosity that I document that's going on around the country, almost in a parallel economy, the alternative. So which way we'll go, we don't know. I mean, that's why this is such an interesting time.
So tie for me together a change to a new kind of economy, and at the same time, if we're going to have any kind of thriving economy, we have to have a broad-based middle class. Any country that's America, as you say, has to start with a broad-based middle class. But the broad-based middle class, in a way, is also kind of part of the old order. And how does that fit in your worldview? And then maybe we'll go to business and how that fits for business. But how do those fit together?
Well, a broad-based middle class is essential for everything, both for a healthy economy and for a stable democracy. And the founding fathers knew that, and that's really what is missing now. And let me just give actually one piece of evidence about that, which is that 100 million Americans right now are worse off than their parents were. And in the latest survey that I read on the subject, 2/3 of Americans expect their children to be worse off. 2/3.
Really? 2/3?
Yeah. And in statistics of upward mobility around the world, America is now 10th, behind France and Germany and Finland and Sweden. For us to be behind France in upward mobility is a little bit like France being behind us in fine wines and croissants and afternoon sex, Not good.
All depends on which statistics you're following, I guess, on the
afternoon sex.
On the afternoon sex front. Meanwhile,
other than in Pasadena, that's the new normal.
I see. It's because the rush hour is preventing you from getting home.
26 million people unemployed or underemployed with lots of time in their hands.
So there is an upside to the problems with the economy then.
So to speak, yes.
But actually, so, well.
We can take this on the road, right? Yeah.
Of the many directions we could go from here, how about this one? So part of it is that people really feel, my children are going to be worse off than I was, which is a real turning point for America. And yet, on the other hand, one of the things that's interesting about places like China and India is they're feeling the opposite, right? For the first time, people are feeling that, my children are going to be better off in ways that seemed really hopeless before. So to what extent is this really a problem with our country? And to what extent is this just the sort of natural migration of privilege as the economy, moves, kind of natural growing pains as we move out into a more global, better economy?
Oh, I don't think that this was inevitable at all. I don't think that this was predetermined based on global trends. I think that, and I trace what happened to the middle class since 1980. Under both the Republican and Democratic administrations, because it wasn't just the Reagan years. We saw during the Clinton years, the trend towards putting Wall Street at the center of our economic life. Right. So instead of Wall Street being an enabler of the real economy, it became sort of a world unto itself. And the financialization of our economy was really a way that the middle class was undermined. Because what happened is that basically Wall Street shorted the middle class. And what happened is that the avalanche of lobbyists descending on Washington made sure that mortgage companies and credit card companies had all that they needed to include what Elizabeth Warren calls the tricks and traps into their small print that made it possible to have the kind of subprime mortgages we had, while Wall Street found ways to profit from them, that made it possible for credit card companies to start with teaser introductory rates, interest rates to our children in colleges, right? And that very quickly skyrocketed to 29% and 30% because of the small print that nobody reads. And we had credit card contracts going from a page and a half to 29 and 30 pages. And as Elizabeth Warren says, she's a Harvard law professor and she can't understand them. That was not accidental. It was not accidental that in Delaware, they no longer had usury laws, so that credit card companies could be based there and charge those kind of rates. It's not accidental that even with the credit card reform, they can still charge those rates.
You're saying they sort of set things up so that being an exploitive business was more profitable than being a long-range sort of customer-generating healthy business.
The amount of money that banks and credit card companies make from these fees, including banks and overdraft fees, is staggering, which is why I have in the book the recommendation that people move their money from big banks to community banks and credit unions that are A, more likely to reinvest in small business in the community, and B, less likely to have all these hidden fees that they make so much money from.
And it's a great section of the book, and there's this whole section on what an individual can do differently and think differently, and it's almost like there's this whole alternative economy emerging. But there's, and forgive me, you don't say very much to business people themselves. Maybe this isn't the book where you wanted to do that, but now you've got an audience of business people, or at least some of you are business people, and and what do you say to them? Because maybe, you know, if the model was exploitive that has led to so much profit, is the answer for business people to sort of ride that model until it dies, or is that model going to crash of its own weight, or what is an appropriate business person who wants to build on a middle class and be prosperous because of it? What do they do? Well,
lots of things. First of all, let me just say that I'm not expecting business people to be altruistic. You know, they're in business. They need to make a profit. But there is absolutely no contradiction in the long term between profitability and social responsibility. I think it's the way that basically we went from a country that makes things to a country that makes things up. That's the problem, you know. And we saw this on Wall Street. I mean, we saw the credit default swaps and toxic derivatives that the CEOs of a lot of these banks could not explain. And then, of course, we saw this didn't work out very well for them. So it's not like this exploitive model works. It worked because the government bailed them out. Otherwise, they would all have gone the way of Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns. So that's a very important moment. You know, really, they should all have been out, done. This, according to private enterprise capitalist rules, they should not exist.
You're asking a lot of government, in a way.
No, on the contrary. I'm saying our government should have either stayed out of the way. On the contrary, I'm giving a position that is very congruent with a lot of conservatives, a lot of people who are saying either government should have stayed out of the way or it should have imposed stringent conditions that would have helped the real economy, that would have included what they were going to lend to small business, instead of which they cut lending by $100 billion. That definitely would not have included giving 100 cents to the dollar to Goldman Sachs as an AIG counterparty. That was a terrible deal that the government struck for the taxpayer. So I'm not asking a lot for government. I'm asking to do their job or get out of the way.
Well, you know, this is something...
I'm angry.
I suspect
I'm not joining the Tea Party. There are lots of people who are angry who are not joining the Tea Party, but there is anger out there because there is a sense that the game is rigged, that the dice are loaded, and that people are paying a heavy price for that. I mean, I don't know how many of you know people who are out of work or whose kids are graduating from college and they can't find a job. This is really a calamity out there. I've been traveling around the country on my book tour, and it's very sad what's happening. And even people who have jobs, even people who are not in trouble themselves, they have relatives or they have friends who are being affected. And so it's affecting the whole mood of the country.
And you don't know when it's going to be you next. And it's
yes, exactly.
We're here in the Drucker's home, and one of his big themes was that management is the same, whether it's public sector, private sector. And a lot of your book is right on target about government and the various institutions and the sort of the lost opportunities. But how much of that is the decisions and the policies, and how much of it is really just that government isn't managed the way it ought to be? That how much of it is a management problem as opposed to a policy problem?
Oh, it's both, but it
Yeah.
starts with the policy problem.
Huh.
But beyond the policy problem, there is a management problem because the default position for management by government is secrecy. And we are moving...
Secrecy
Yes.
from each other or from
Well,
us?
secrecy from the public. You know, even though we now have the technologies that would make transparency very easy, it's still very hard to find out what government is doing. We still don't really know what happened to the TARP money.
Right, even
Despite all the requests, we still don't know. We still don't quite know what the Fed is doing with the 0% financing through the Fed window and who is benefiting and what's happening. You know, there are tremendous questions.
You don't quite buy it when they say that they made a profit on GM or...
Well, you know, the one thing I learned at Cambridge when I studied economics, the most important concept that I learned in my economics course was the concept of the opportunity cost.
Right.
So I want to know what would have happened to the economy and the middle class if that $800 billion had gone to the middle class through creating jobs, through avoiding foreclosures. Then I would be able to compare the two worlds that we would be living in.
Now, what would you have done differently in terms of deciding to pick and choose? You know, say a little bit more about that. I mean, in the book you say, you know, give the money back to the states as opposed to the companies, but...
Oh, no. There's a long list of solutions. I mean,
Yeah.
if we wanted to go back, the first and most important thing would have been to realize where the real danger was. And the president's economic team did not realize that. Even after they'd bailed out the banks, they really assumed, as Larry Summers said again and again, that unemployment is a lagging indicator. They really completely missed the fact that there were huge structural changes happening. I mean, I was on This Week, and when George Stephanopoulos was hosting, and there was Larry Summers, and he sounded like Chancellor Gardner. There will be growth in the spring, he said. Well, then it turned out there was no growth in the spring. He had gotten it all wrong, not because he's not a brilliant man, he's a brilliant man, but his model of the world is entirely Wall Street-centric. It would be as though you were talking to a pre-Galilean scientist who was explaining the world on the basis that the earth was flat. That was the problem with Summers. And I actually wrote about it at the time. So this is not like hindsight. I wrote about it. I wrote a blog post called Larry Summers' Brilliant Men, Toxic Ideas. And the next day I happened to be in the White House meeting with David Axel, and he came out of his office. And of course, he's a Harvard professor, which I love about him. And he said, let's talk about that. And we stood in the corridor arguing about it in a very sort of good collegiate way, which is why he has this brilliant mind and why he prevailed in the room with the president.
Lots of arguments at Harvard, no doubt about him. You're just kind of echoing through the... So business people have to compete on price. And Wall Street Bank, we ran an article in our magazine called What Banking Ought to Become. And it came just after the meltdown. It was a very idealistic article about, you know, that basically started from the point of view that banks also have a long-term interest in a large middle class. And in a way, it's kind of amazing they didn't see that.
I'd love to read that.
I'll make sure you get one. But it's... But do you ever get bankers coming to you and saying, you know, how would we do different? Do they care? Is there an empathetic financial services industry out there? And is it large? Is it small? Do they read the Huffington Post?
Yes, and they advertise there. In fact, the day since we're an advertising-based business model, the day that we launched our Move Your Money campaign, which was a splash on the front page with a very good video. I don't know if you happen to see it, that took off It's a Wonderful Life and Mr. Bailey and Mr. Potter. And it happened to be the day, I didn't know because we have a Chinese wall between editorial and advertising, that Bank of America had taken huge ads on the front page of the Huffington Post. So that was an interesting moment when we had Move Your Money as a splash and Bank of America under it. But we just hired Peter Goodman from the New York Times to be our business editor, and I'm really, really excited about what he's doing. I just received a 10-page memo from him about what he's planning to do, the people he's hiring as reporters, and Peter sees basically what our business coverage moving forward as two things. One, what he calls intelligent outrage, meaning fact-based, intelligent, but outrage.
Right.
And the second is putting the spotlight on what's working, putting the spotlight on innovation, profiling businesses that are working, however small, profiling good business practices. So we see us doing both increasingly. In fact, we launched a small business blog, which is really, it's very exciting to read it because you see what people are doing, and the way they're using social media to create jobs, whether it's Etsy.com or Bonanza.com.
And they have global markets that you don't have to be huge to be selling all around the world anymore.
Yes.
In the same way. You don't have to be working with new technologies. I want to ask you one very difficult question, and we'll invite the audience to ask even more difficult questions. But so business people, and you're an entrepreneur, a media entrepreneur, so you're dealing with business realities, and you have to compete on price. And
Well, we don't charge anything, so it's
you don't
easy.
charge, yeah. Well, but you still have to pay your people, and you still have to manage for all of the business realities at the same times that you're sort of providing a service, etc. What did the banks do that was different? Didn't they all get into it because they were simply competing on price with each other in the same way that you're now competing with Yahoo or the New York Times or whatever, and trying to figure out different ways to make a dollar that your competitors can't? What was different about what the banks did?
Well, what basically happened with the banks is that they started increasingly they became about gambling rather than productivity or enabling the real economy. It became gambling. What are toxic derivatives? What are the...
all in a name.
Well, whatever you want to call it. If you go back to what brought down AIG, what was happening in the London office, I don't know how you can justify that in business terms, let alone, how can you justify, even in purely business terms, leaving aside social responsibility, something that brings a company down? I really think that's really the question that bankers and business people can ask. How can you justify something that would have meant you were not going to be in existence were it not for the taxpayer? And that's why one of the things that I feel is critical, and that's why I'm concerned that the financial reform bill does not address it, is the fact that you cannot allow companies to pose a systemic risk. And that's the problem with
the country, to the world at large.
Because then we're on the hook, and we don't want to be on the hook ever, because businesses can take any amount of risk they want. It's a free country, but then they also need to bear the consequences.
Questions?
Hi.
I'd love actually if you introduce yourselves and tell me what you do.
My name is Sylvia Holmes, and I have a website called reviewsbywomen.net. And my question is, are there lobbyists in Washington, D.C. for the middle class?
Actually, that's a very good question. I use the same words in the book, and I say there are no lobbyists in Washington for the middle class, and that's the whole problem. And that's why, in a way, it's really good news that Elizabeth Warren got the job she got, because she's a lobbyist for the middle class. That's why she's there. She has no other agenda. But there are no lobbyists for the middle class, and yet there are 26 lobbyists for every elected representative in Washington, whose job is basically to undermine legislation that would benefit the middle class. So, it's a very uneven playing field. Even as we're sitting here discussing these things, lobbyists are all over Capitol Hill, undermining the financial reform legislation that passed. That's their job. And because politicians need to get reelected and they need their donations, And they end up basically doing their bidding. And you know, the most amazing example of that I have a whole section in the book about, because for me it's so emblematic, is the fact that the banks, even after everything that they did, and even after the bailout, were able, that's how powerful they were, to kill the cram-down amendment that would have prevented over 1 million people from losing their homes. Basically, all that it was about is a loan modification bill. Basically, you know, you should be able to go into negotiations to modify your loan if the alternative is losing your home. That's how fundamental it is, and how corrupt our political system is was really demonstrated by the fact that neither political party really was able to prevail against the banks. Senator Durbin, who was pushing the legislation, actually said in frustration, the banks own this place. That was Senator Durbin who said that. That wasn't, you know, some hippie demonstrating outside Congress. But, you know, I just want to say something before I forget, which is, you know, those of you who are already writing, who have websites, who are already, we would love to cross-post what you are doing, which would drive traffic to you and would give us good content. So it's a kind of good win-win practice. And that's how we really want to be a hub of good thinking and good writing around these areas. And so I'm going to give everybody my email address. And if you want, you can give me your cards, and I'll have Ryan McCarthy, who is our associate business editor, working with outside writers and bloggers, get in touch. But my email address is very simple. It's Arianna, which is 1 R and 2 N's, at HuffingtonPost.com.
What impact will the underbanked community have with this new financial service industry that seems to be growing in the country, with these check cashing industries, payday loans, that seems to service this huge, I read it's up to 28 to even 30% in some communities, because the traditional banks aren't lending and cashing checks and so forth. What impact will that service and that industry have on that population?
Well, the impact will depend on whether they are regulated or not. You know, if they're not regulated, as so many payday loan operations have not been, the impact can be disastrous. And, you know, one of the most entertaining quotes in my book is by Alan Greenspan, when he was testifying in Congress recently, and he kind of shared with the world his realization that human nature is not perfect. He was really stunned by the fact that all these people he completely trusted to do only the right thing had not done only the right thing. And that's why we need regulations. You know, if people were perfect, we would not need regulations. And so that it will all depend on how regulated these businesses are. And also, and just as significant, whether we have regulatory capture. Because we've seen that. We've seen that there were businesses that were very regulated. But in the end, the regulated completely captured the regulators. Whether it was, we saw that with the BP oil spill, we saw that with the mining industry. You know, you had a safety, you had a regulator at the mine the day that it collapsed.
And yet so many business people feel overregulated. I mean, on one level it's too much, and on another level it's too little. What hope is there for even sorting it out?
Well, I think there is hope, and I think that the regulatory capture is why they feel overregulated. I mean, Fannie and Freddie, you know, they had entire agencies regulating them, right? They obviously didn't do a good job.
I was wondering if you could touch on the whole transfer of wealth that we've seen, particularly over the last decade, but over the past 2 or 3 decades. There was a point when we used to have a 90% tax on the wealthy, but we're at a point now where our whole wealth has moved up to a very small group of people. And can you talk about how that's affecting our economy and the middle class?
Well, it's affecting our economy right now in very immediate ways, because we don't have the demand that used to drive the economy. the consumer demand that was at the heart of our economic success is not there. If you look at the latest data that came out this week, luxury goods are up. But I'm sure, I'm sure you can buy a Gulfstream.
In fact, the Gulfstream business is booming. But
Yes. The Gulfstream business is booming, and I want you to know that. And I don't know whether, I was talking to a friend of mine who's in the Gulfstream category the other day, who was complaining that landing fees are up. I thought you would want to know that even the super rich have things to complain about.
On the other hand, though, wasn't part of the problem just the amount of stuff that people?
Yes, and that's why I'm, to go back to your second question, that's why I think the new normal, if we don't go the third world America way, is going to be better than the old normal, because after all, there has to be a value reset. Right. The idea that life, that's why we talked about moving from competition to meaning, because the idea of what makes life worthwhile cannot be consumption. That has to be in the background. The question, my mother, who was very wise and self-educated, used to say that, you had to decide what was in the foreground of your life and what was in the background of your life. You can have things in the background of your life, but they become your raison d'etre. There were people who were actually renting private storage space to put things that they were buying that they didn't have room for in their apartments. Now that becomes like an addiction. And our culture was definitely promoting that.
Enabling our compulsive hoarders.
My wife and I have a small company. We bought a building in 2007. Then the recession hit in 2008. Got in problems with it. Went to the Bank of America, and they wouldn't even talk to us. So they got bailed out. But we small business people, we don't get bailed out. We have to deal with the situation that we have. If you go to try and get to your congressmen or senators or anybody, you can't unless you donated $10,000 to them. You can't even get an appointment with them. How do you deal with that imbalance of power?
We would love to take your case up. I just on my way here, I had a flurry of emails from our reporters about what Bank of America is doing and how they're actually going to expose a lot of the practices there. So if you give me your card, I'll put Arthur Delaney, who is actually looking at what's happening with Bank of America around a lot of these instances. Get in touch with you and write about it. And again, if you know other stories, I feel now that what we can do at the Huffington Post is put the spotlight both on stories like that of unfairness, of this imbalance of power, as you put it. This is a very good way of describing it. And also put the spotlight on what is working, on how people are creating jobs for themselves, how people are helping each other. So we want to do both, but your story is perfect for this. In fact, we have created an interactive map, if you go to the Third World America section, and we have stars for each story in each part of the country, and we have thousands of stories. So you can click, say, on Pasadena and find out about your story, and people have a sense of what's happening, and they can connect with each other and help each other, and that's happening around the country now. And I just want to end on an optimistic note.
Let's take one more question,
Yes.
and then I'll ask you an
I don't want to end on a downer.
This is Yeo Makina. I'm working as a freelance journalist for Japanese magazine. So I'm interested in this question. What are you most proud of in launching the Huffington Post, particularly in its impact on the White House and policymaking?
What I'm most proud of is the fact that we've created a vehicle that does have an impact, that we now have 25 million unique visitors a month. We have 24 sections that deal with different aspects of life, and that we have a very passionate team of reporters and editors. We have a total staff now of 190, but an editorial staff of almost 100 people now, and we are growing. And the fact that they are determined to have an impact. And I just will tell you a story. Arthur Delaney, who I'm going to put in touch with you, 2 years ago, I asked him to become what we called our economic impact correspondent. So his only job is to put flesh and blood on the data, to find the stories like your story and report them. Because I think we journalists are doing too much data mining and not enough storytelling. And you're not going to capture the public imagination just with data. So our job is to tell stories as well as provide the data. And to keep doing it. That's the other thing. So often mainstream media break a story and then they move on. We don't move on. We stay on. It's like if they suffer from ADD, attention deficit disorder, we suffer from OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So because our goal is to just stay on a story and stay on a story until something happens, until we can break through the static. And that takes a lot of approaching an issue through different ways. And I feel now, right now, what we're doing about that, for example, is putting the spotlight also on what people are doing that is working. And our editorial theme is that our national conversation is focusing on our deficits, our budget deficit, our job shortages. We need to also start, focusing on our surpluses. We have a surplus of time, skills, and resources that are not being used. And we need to turn that around. And so we have stories of an unemployed man in Portland, Oregon, who started a website called we'vegottime-to-help.org. And because his name is Seth Reams, and because I talk about him everywhere, including the Jon Stewart Show, Bill Maher, Diane Sawyer, he now has 50 applications from around the country to help them set up We've Got Time to Help groups around the country. And we've set him up as a not-for-profit. If anybody wants to work with him, it's a great case study of how he can take people with time and make them contributing members of society, which also dramatically changes how they see themselves. Instead of being depressed and feeling useless, they can be empowered and feeling productive. And they can do it at the level of Seth, who has no skills, beyond what he knows, but he doesn't have a formal education, to the lawyers who did that, who are doing that in Philadelphia, and now it's spreading, who are coming together to help people avoid foreclosures. It can basically happen across the spectrum, and that's a tremendous source of optimism for me.
My name is Jenny Lucca. I'm the National Executive Director of Step Up Women's Network. Us being a nonprofit organization, we support connecting and advancing women and girls. We are made up of professional business women supporting teens in the community for mentorship. We do direct service work on the ground, but we also collaborate with businesses so that we can work with their employees to provide them with volunteer opportunities, all those things. How can we as a nonprofit have a conversation with a business that kind of moves that concept of collaboration forward? We already collaborate with a lot of businesses. We're very happy to work with their foundation giving, with their charitable giving budgets. But how does corporate social responsibility and that spirit of collaboration really go beyond that? Because that, the foundation budgets tank when business profits go down. Do you have any recommendations for kind of taking it to that next level?
Absolutely. In fact, I think that's the most exciting challenge, taking the great work that you're doing, say, to the next level. I think, how do you scale up? How do you accelerate what you're already doing? Because the urgency is there. So we need you to scale up and accelerate. And we are doing a lot of that through, again, focusing on what's working, and by using social media, you will be connected automatically to others who want to be part of what you're doing, whether in business or in the not-for-profit sector. And for example, yesterday we launched a new feature that we are calling the greatest person of the day. So we are putting the spotlight on somebody who is doing something creative. So if you get in touch with us, and our editor who is running this project is called Grace Kaiser, grace@huffingtonpost.com. So if you connect with Grace, say if you want to profile what businesses are doing with your help and turn them into best person of the day, which then you can send out to other businesses as an example of how they can benefit directly. If you connect to the marketing departments of businesses, not just the foundations. I was at Coca-Cola speaking to their employees in Atlanta last week. They are very acutely engaged in cost marketing. they recognize the importance for selling product to be identified with also doing good. My favorite example of that is the advertising that's going on right now for Shiva's whiskey. Have you seen it? I'm going to write about it, so I'll in the next few days, because I just found out who did the advertising, and I'm getting in touch with them, because it's so tapping into the zeitgeist. It starts by saying some people only live life for themselves, and it goes on and talks to you about buying Shiva's whiskey. I don't know what the connection is, but the guy is tapping into something powerful. So my point is that if they're selling Shiva's whiskey through altruism, imagine what most businesses can do by tapping into that. What did Pepsi Refresh do? Their whole Pepsi Refresh campaign was, we're not going to spend millions buying Super Bowl advertising. We're going to spend helping people, which is what you're talking about. So you need to get beyond the foundation budgets to the marketing budgets, which are infinitely bigger and which can have a much more direct effect. And also tell us the stories, and we'll publicize them.
One last question.
Hi, my name is Arianna Huffington, and I'm with LatinoPoliticsBlog.com. That's my site. And I've written a little bit about the foreclosures and the banking crisis and that type of thing on my own site as it pertains to the Latino community. But just more broadly, many civil rights organizations are sponsored by big banks. How can people trust that the organizations are actually advocating on behalf of the people that they purport to represent are actually doing that, when a lot of the galas and events and even the civil rights programs are underwritten by B of A and Citibank, and even the check cashing places that Victor Griego mentioned as well. So I'm just kind of curious as to what you think about that, the relationship between civil rights organizations and the banks and the sponsorship, and really, are they truly grassroots?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I think you need to look at the work they're doing. I mean, that's you, as Ronald Reagan famous says, it's not about who endorses you, but who do you endorse. If they want to take money from Bank of America and still do their job, that's fine with me. The question is, are they still doing their job? And you need to collect the evidence if they're not. So for me, it's a question of how tainted are they by the money they take. You don't have to be tainted. You can take the money and tell the truth, but you need to look at the evidence.
So for a closing word, speak a little bit to those of us who still have our jobs and expect to keep them. And yet we have, we work for these institutions, government, business, that, haven't been exactly fully trustworthy up till now, or some of them haven't. What can we do different tomorrow?
First of all, I like that you said, what can we do tomorrow? I would even say, what can we do today? Because I think the most important thing is to bring a sense of urgency to what is happening. So if those of us who still have our jobs can also recognize that leading a good life just within our own families is no longer enough. Jon Stewart asked me that. He said, isn't it enough to just be a good parent and a provider and just take care of your family? I said, in normal times, it is enough. But these are not normal times. These are extraordinary times. So we need to add to whatever we're doing something that is about giving back, something that is about contributing, whatever that may be. And if it is also connected with our passion, if it is connected with something that really moves us, it's going to be more powerful. And I feel that this will both increase the chances that we won't be a third world America, but that we will actually find this new normal and this value reset. And it will also bring more meaning to our own personal lives, because everybody who has done that can testify to the fact that their life is richer, has more purpose, and more significance. And ultimately, we all have that in our DNA. I write in the book, and maybe that's a good place to end, about the fact that most biologists and psychologists talk about three instincts, survival, sex, and power. And I argue that there is a fourth instinct, and that's the instinct to find meaning in life, to make sense of life, to make life about something more than just ourselves. And so that instinct is there. When we tap into it, then we are more engaged, more creative, and happier. Not bad.
Thank you.